During the 13th and 14th centuries, the Mongols, once a powerful patchwork of various steppe peoples, became the bearers of one of the most powerful and largest empires in history. Just looking at a map of the empire during its zenith is something to behold. At nearly triple the size of the United States in land area, it was the largest contiguous empire in history. Interestingly, looking at that same map, you'll notice Japan is absent from their territories. Why is this? Well, I can tell you it wasn't for lack of trying. The Mongol Empire was an empire of conquest. While not deriving all of their wealth from plunder, it certainly was a major contributor. By the time we get to the reign of Kublai Khan, the frontiers of the empire were stretched. It was at this point a collection of mostly independent states, de jure under the rule of the Khagan, but de facto each domain established by the Mongols in their respective regions were assimilating to the peoples to whom they had been tasked with administrating, and the ties between them had been waiting even before the reign of Kublai, who himself had to deal with the civil war at the beginning of his reign, as half the empire supported his brother Arik Bok as the next Khan. Kublai had set his sights on completing the dreams of his grandfather Genghis Khan and conquering the world, a difficult and expensive task, with China's Song dynasty being the toughest of his challenges. Unlike their northern counterparts, the Jin, they had held out under the attacks from previous Khans Ogadai and Mongke, and they had sworn to never let the mandate of heaven be co-opted by the foreign hordes. Eventually, after 44 years of war, the Song would finally crumble to Kublai. This was a hugely expensive war and had all but bankrupted the Mongol state, even as they took spoils of war. And this, my friends, is where Japan comes in. For as long as it had been known to the outside world, Japan was fabled to be a land rich in gold, so much so that Persian geographer Ibn Khaldun described a land he knew as Al-Waqwaq, what we know today as Japan, being so rich in gold that they made dog collars and chains out of the metal. While there is some truth to the richness of Japan's gold, it has more to do with the quality of the metal rather than the quantity, and the legends were later found out to be, well, just that. Legends. Kublai, however, didn't know this, and the idea of vassalizing a land so rich in gold, especially as their coffers grew exhausted from the Song Wars, was too tantalizing a prospect to ignore. And thusly, Kublai sent emissaries to the Hojo, who were the de facto rulers of Japan at this time despite not being the shoguns, bearing a letter which stated, "Cherished by the mandate of heaven, the great Yuan Emperor sends his letter to the King of Japan. The sovereigns of small countries sharing borders with each other have for a long time been concerned to communicate with each other and become friendly, especially since my ancestor, governed at heaven's command, innumerable countries from afar disputed our power and slighted our virtue. Korea rendered thanks for my ceasefire, and for restoring their land and people. When I ascended the throne, our relation was feudatory, like a father and son. We think you already know this. Korea is my eastern tributary. Japan was allied with Korea, and sometimes with China, since the founding of your country. However, Japan has never dispatched ambassadors since my ascending to the throne. We are afraid that your kingdom is yet to know this, hence why we dispatched a mission with our letter, particularly expressing our wishes. Enter into friendly relations with each other from now on. We think that all countries belong to one family. How are we in the right unless we comprehend this? Nobody would wish to resort to arms. TLDR, be my vassal or face the wrath of the Mongols." The emissaries returned to Kublai empty-handed. The Hojo had stated that since Japan was of divine origin, of course, the mandate of heaven held no dominion over them. As you can imagine, this didn't sit well with Kublai. His empire was vast and many lesser foes, as he saw Japan, would bend the knee to the Mongols without so much as a fight out of fear. This hubris led Kublai to believe that the Japanese would give in without any fuss. He was wrong. And so an invasion was planned for 1274, and on November 2nd of that year, a fleet carrying 30,000 men embarked for Tsushima. The goal was to take the lesser islands in the Korean Strait and use them as bases to attack Kyushu, and eventually Honshu, where the Hojo clan resided far to the east in Izu and Sagami. And the invasion was actually going quite well for the Mongols. They had landed at Kyushu quicker than they had expected, after easily taking Tsushima and Iki. However, due to the war against the Song ongoing back in China, and fear of greater Japanese resistance as they pushed further inland, the Yuan decided it more prudent to return to Korea and prepare with a larger force for a later invasion. And so they departed at night, under ominous winds. This was against the advice of the sailors. To sail from Kyushu to Korea, it is best to make the journey during the day and under fair southern winds. This still holds true to today. But the leaders of the Mongol forces feared Kamakura retaliation, and thus they left at night. They would soon find themselves in the middle of a deadly typhoon, and nearly the entire fleet and the 30,000 men with it were wiped out. This news greatly angered the Khan, but he was a little tied up in southern China, so he wasn't able to plan a second invasion until he was done dealing with the last vestiges of the Song, which would finally fall at the Battle of Yamen in 1279. With the former territories of the Song now firmly under their control and the formidable navy now theirs, the Yuan felt emboldened and ready to prepare for another, much larger invasion, and they would do just that in 1281 with over 4,000 ships and 140,000 men. There would be no army of the Kamakura ready to take on such a force, or so the Yuan had thought. The Kamakura were not fools, and they knew, if not anything else, the Mongols were persistent, and would return in greater numbers after licking their wounds. The islands of Tsushima and Iki were manned by samurai in much greater numbers than before, and the best beaches for landing on Kyushu were fortified with walls and watchtowers, which could easily spot any invading force. Once again, despite bolstering their forces at Tsushima and Iki, they would be taken by the Yuan by the northern fleet, which had sailed from Korea. And after they took the island, they were to wait for the southern fleet, which was sailing from South China. This was a much larger force, and it comprised of the Song Navy. However, the first fleet decided to set sail for Fukuoka ahead of the second reinforcing fleet. Why they did this is unknown. Maybe they wished to blitz the Japanese before they could prepare for them. Or perhaps they were seeking glory, which they didn't wish to share. Or, most likely, it was just poor communication. Coordinating armies is difficult enough on land, let alone at sea, and the Yuan forces would have comprised of Mongol, Korean, and various Chinese peoples, all speaking different languages, so it's not difficult to assume that there could have been some things lost in translation. Landing at Hakata Bay, the Yuan were surprised to see just how well fortified the area had become since their first invasion only 7 years earlier, and the high walls built along the beaches were laden with archers. The northern forces simply couldn't get past the beach, and they were forced to retreat to the nearby Hirota Island, where they would wait for the coming South Fleet to reinforce them. Much to their surprise, the Japanese would pursue them. Conducting night raids and attacking supply ships, their tactics were effective and the separated Mongol forces began to grow desperate. After the southern fleet joined with the northern fleet, the two took some time rearranging themselves before advancing on Takashima Island. The Japanese repeated their small raids on the invasion fleet, and the Mongols responded by fastening their ships together with chains and planks to provide defensive platforms. After a while, the morale of the Yuan grew abysmal. They had now been at sea since May, and it was now August. The soldiers were malnourished and exhausted, and the Han Chinese, many of whom were fighting the Yuan themselves just 2 years prior, were abandoning the campaign altogether. While the desperate Yuan forces decided on where to land next, a kamikaze hit. Chained together and stuck near Takashima, if there was any chance of salvaging the fleet before, there was now virtually none. Their fate was now quite literally tied together. The damage caused by the typhoon was catastrophic, and of the reported 140,000 troops, only 20,000 survived. By the way guys, there really isn't a way for us to know the exact number of ships and troops that were sent to Japan by the Mongols. Historians, especially when you're going back centuries, tended to exaggerate these things for various reasons. Many historians contest the 100,000 plus numbers, believing that there simply wasn't technology in place in the 13th century that would allow for such a navy to exist. I've seen estimates that the true numbers may have been closer to 20 or 30,000 for both invasions, or at the very most 70 to 80,000. Regardless, it was a huge navy and likely the largest the world had ever seen up until that point. Just always remember that the further you go back in history, the more difficult it gets to nail with precision the facts of, well, anything really. The invasions of Japan were a devastating blow to the Yuan, both in terms of ships and lives lost, as well as financially. The Mongols would never again attempt to take Japan, and by the 1320s, some 40 years after the events of the invasion, the Yuan Emperor Huaizong had made peace with the Japanese, recognizing and guaranteeing their sovereignty. The invasions were not without their lasting influence either. Japan had very little experience in battling foreigners, and had largely up until this point kept to fighting themselves. Gunpowder warfare that the Mongols had adopted from their conquest surprised and terrified the samurai, and after their invasions, Japanese interest in the Asian mainland grew immensely, especially the idea of conquest. Well anyways guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. With Ghost of Tsushima launching, I thought I would do some videos around the events of the game, but I am going to branch out and do some other topics, and I would love to hear some suggestions if you have any. Hope you enjoyed it, consider liking and subscribing, and yeah, cheers.